going to talk to you about creative industries and what I call the global contemporary economy and so on. But I just wanted to preface it by talking more broadly and in fact a link to the presentation from Gabriela. I work at university, and I think the critical issue that she dealt with in her presentation is germane to a lot of work that I do, and in many respects frames the ways in which I've interacted with industry and the policy arena. So I think it's important that I speak a little bit about that first. In that regard, I only returned last night from Bahamas, where the event happened, which is the Caribbean, well, Regional Caribbean Growth Forum, to be precise, which was funded and supported by World Bank, IDB, Compete Caribbean, Caribbean Development Bank, Caribbean Export. I will come to what any of the agencies.
And directed. Funded and directed.
Funded and directed. And supported in part also by the Bahamas government. And my particular task in that Regional Caribbean Growth Forum was to act as an expert facilitator on the issue of skills, productivity, and innovation. And I was asked to review all of the country reports. And after reviewing all of the country reports, some of which are embodied in some of these listing of challenges and bottlenecks and so on, and also a list of proposals. I don't want to talk about this, that will take too long. This is what I came away with in terms of the way forward. I identified 3 specific, let's call them paradigmatic frameworks, which we need to understand and possibly correct if it is we are really serious about innovation. So the first is what I call a demand pull approach. Most of the proposals that were identified were supply push approaches. So for example, the comment I keep using is that if you produce the skills, then the jobs will come. In fact, we produce a lot of skills for which there are no jobs. And so the alternative approach is a demand pull approach, where we figure out what, where, who is the market, what is required for us to supply the required goods, service, or intellectual property. So that was the first element of what I suggested as the way forward. The second is I broadly call it an innovation agenda, which is premised on the notion that, or question the notion, if we are productive, we will prosper. Well, you can actually be productive in the wrong industries. In fact, in many parts of the Caribbean, we are actually quite productive. I know this comes as a surprise to you, but it's what Arthur Lewis argued, and even Professor Reinhardt, who I collaborate a lot on with, argues that you are productive, you have a high level of productivity in industry, and all the benefits of the innovation and productivity go to your clients, not to you or your workers, because your prices keep dropping, and they get the margins. Right? So in Haiti, for example, Professor Reinhardt has a paper on the Caribbean, and he looks at Haiti. He says Haiti is the best producer of baseballs in the world. It's just that the local value added keeps declining year in, year out. It's very labor intensive, and the workers who are making the baseballs, who are very productive, they can outcompete anybody else in the world in terms of making baseballs, and they are getting poorer year in, year out. So it is not about productivity. You can be productive in the wrong industries. So what Professor Reiner argues is that you have to be in the right industry, you have to be in the right part of the industry, meaning the right part of the commodity or value chain. You want to be in the part of the value chain where it is increasing in value, not diminishing in value. So, and you could then apply that policy to almost every sector that we have in the Caribbean and other parts of the developing world. We are at the low end of the value chain, and in the declining or diminishing value end of the value chain. So in the tourism industry, which is one of the areas we've supposedly diversified away from agriculture into, we are in the low value end of the value chain. Right? There's no Caribbean country that gets more than about 50% of every tourism dollar. Whereas in other parts, for example in Central America, let's say Costa Rica, their domestic value added in tourism is somewhere between 50 and 60%. So they're tripling the value added relative to us. So for every effort we make, ours could only at best be 1/3 of what is happening in Costa Rica. So the other key point that I noticed from the country report is that the emphasis was on challenges, not on opportunities. And the comment that I make here is that entrepreneurs spot opportunities. That's what an entrepreneur does. Whereas administrators often can only see challenges. So a long list of challenges, but nobody is focusing on what are the opportunities. And so, if we are to move towards a demand-driven innovation framework, there's some key things that we must do. First of all, we have to figure out what are the sectors that are rising in the future, what and where are these markets, what are the products. When I buy products, I mean products, services, forms of intellectual property, and so on. Then we should be figuring out what skills, what level of productivity, and what form of innovation we should be pursuing.
I mean, after reviewing the reports and discerning this very useful bit of information, what happened when you put it back to plenary?
That's a good question. The way the event was organized, I don't think we necessarily allowed for that higher level of debate and discerning this kind of output. So I think that given the time frame and the way things are structured, it wasn't really allowed for. Because there were 9 of these groups, and then everything was condensed into bite-sized outputs. That was presented to plenary. So I don't think in plenary we actually got to what I consider to be the big issues. A lot of it was discussed, but in general terms, I would argue, and not with enough evidence base. So we all think that we need to have more skills. We all think we need to have more productivity, and we all can agree that we need more innovation. And so we say that, but with no level of precision. And that's one of the key challenges going forward in this framework, which is that our capacity to monitor and evaluate what we do is very weak because we have very little data on what is happening.
To come back to the Growth Forum, I had the opportunity to actually attend some of the country level ones. The mandate was very clear. The mandate was that the countries and the expertise in the country was supposed to come together and brainstorm over a 6-week period to identify critical binding constraints around 3 particular areas, and then to identify possible recommendations that could be implemented within a 1-year period. It was a very clear mandate in my view. What was interesting to me, because I looked at all of the country reports that went forward to the Bahamas, and again it was that usual shopping list that we come up with. A very general list of very wide recommendations with no timeline, with no time frame built into actually doing it. So that to me it almost speaks to us not having the capacity to be able to come down beyond that kind of very general list of recommendation. Because again, time after time, you look at consultant reports and you see, again, those are the kinds of recommendations we get. Or the recommendation is that we need to do another study in order to come up with a recommendation. So the challenge to me is how do we move beyond understanding the general constraints, already drilling down sector by sector, even further down segment by segment, in order to create the innovation systems around those as a basis for growth.
Those are the last few slides in my presentation. So if you want to get started, and so we can cut to the cheese.
I like to support Indira's point because I was also a part of productivity for my country as well, and had an opportunity to be privy to the feedback from the different areas. And it was challenging, I would say, coming up with the different timelines in terms of what we wanted to get done. And I think even though it was good to have both the public and private involvement in the process, there was a challenge in terms of taking that process now, or how could the private sector with the public sector actually put timelines to what the country needed to do. And I think that's a challenge that we have as well too, because to some extent the private sector cannot really say, to some extent, what the public sector is going to be able to fulfill within a year's time.
Okay. You're already going to answer that question now. Let me go through some of my slides and let's move over here. All right? Creative industries and innovation governance in the contemporary global economy. That's the title of my presentation. Conceptualizing the Caribbean economic performance, defining and mapping the creative industries, innovation governance and foresighting strategy, and then talking about the way forward for the Caribbean. So, I published a book last year, 2 years now actually, and this is the first diagram in the book. This tracks the growth of rate in many different parts of the world over the last few years. And you can see that period from 2008 is a very dramatic shift. Now, this is what we refer to as a global economic crisis. I've put in my other slides, which would substantiate what I'm going to say next, which is that we are not in just a global economic crisis. We are in a major transformation from one kind of global economy into another kind of global economy. In the Schumpeterian sense, and I'm sure you all maybe have come across the Schumpeterian ideas in the last few days, we're in an age of creative destruction, which is that many of the key elements of the global economy are being destroyed and new things are being created. And in the process, some countries do well and others won't do well. In fact, I describe this, I think we can disaggregate it. What we have is a four-speed global economy. Christine Lagarde calls it a three-speed economy. The OECD, the BRICS, and the rest. I call it a four-speed global economy, which is the OECD countries, which are growing at no more than about 3%, and projections are, with the exception maybe of Germany, stay there or do worse. Then you have the BRICS, who are growing maybe in excess of 4%, 5%, in some cases. So when China is dropping below 8%, for them it's a crisis. Actually, it's really remarkable. They're concerned that it's dropping below 8%. India is somewhere around there, 6%. They've been faltering a bit. Brazil has been faltering a bit. But their growth trajectory is in that area. Then you have the economies that are exporting stuff to the BRICS. So like in our context in the Caribbean, that's Guyana, that's Suriname. They're growing at somewhere between 3 and 5%. And then the last group is the economies that are dependent on the OECD economies to export to, like most of the rest of the Caribbean. And they're growing at no more than 1 to 2%. In fact, they cannot grow faster than their trading partners. That's the theory, right? The economies in the Caribbean that are dependent on the OECD economies for their exports will not grow faster than the OECD economies, unless they hitch their wagon to a different group. And that's very difficult. All right? So, what we have is a forced global economy. So, let's figure out where you are in that framework. This is the Caribbean performance over the last 20 to 30 years. And so, the global economic crisis is not because of our problem. It's the latest nail in the coffin. But I call this my lightning diagram. It shows that, lightning goes to the sky. This is what's happening. I call it falling out of the world economy. Our share of global value added has been dropping at a very rapid rate for decades now. Then when you compare us with other parts of the world, Malaysia, Thailand, Pakistan, and so on, I can give you other data as well. Our performance has been flatlining at best over this period. So, it's only in the last few years, and some of my former students can attest to this, that although I've been talking about the creative economy and writing about it for, 15 years or more, it's only in the last few years, like last 3 years, 5 years at best, that Caribbean governments and other agencies have been interested in the creative economy. Earlier this week, the Barbados government launched its Creative Industries Bill. I think it was the last consultation on the issue. So there's not a minister of finance or even a prime minister now that is not using the creative industries in their dialogue. Why? Because it's one of the few industries that is actually experiencing growth in the context of the global economic crisis. Somewhere between 7 and 8% growth globally in the last several years. So, and its share of global value add is expanded. So in many economies, it's one of the, after tourism, it's one of the fastest growing, but also one of the increasing shares of domestic and global value added. So in countries like in the OECD countries, creative industries or copyright industries, which is where we are asked to measure better, it's somewhere between 5 and 6% of GDP. In the United States, 5 or 6% of GDP. In many European countries, it's around similar lines. In India, it's about somewhere between 3 and 5% of GDP. So the creative industries is nothing to sniff at anymore. You come to recognize that. So what is the creative industry? Well, there are lots of definitions. I use my definition. I have a little bit more comfort in my definition because in the literature on creative industries are aesthetic, their identity, and their copyrightable. Some people emphasize the copyrightable component, some emphasize the aesthetic, some identify the identity elements. So for example, sport would not be categorized as a creative industry. Although some people try to lump it in. The other key element to it is that it's embodied in multiple forms. But you have to look at both the production, the distribution, and the consumption elements associated with it. So for example, someone who produces music is part of the creative industries, but also the record shop, as well as the distributor. Okay. Why is the creative industry becoming so important? Why? Because we entered a post-industrial part of the phase in the global economy, where people's identities are shaped more by what they consume as opposed to what they produce. earlier phase of global capitalism, you would define by what you produced. If you're a farmer, you get that of a farmer. All right, or if you're working in manufacturing, you are, a proletariat. All right, but people's identity are increasingly shaped by what they consume. And in that regard, the aestheticization of production and consumption has become even more important. So, for example, the best-selling goods on the planet are not the ones that are most functional, they're the ones that are best designed. So the best-selling cars, the best-selling computers, the best-selling devices are about aesthetics. And there's increasing convergence of media, sound, text, image, and so on. There's growth of intellectual property and copyright industries, and then there's things like the growth of the apps market. So, for example, a friend showed me an app. It's really interesting. It's called a Pan app. So, if it doesn't get on that app, increasingly it doesn't exist. Right? So, the interface between cultural industries and devices is becoming more and more important. So this is from UNCTAD, their diagram. I think is a fairly useful one, but I want to move past that. The last time I participated in a consultation for the Barbados Creative Industries Bill, I made a comment which I don't think many people were happy, including the minister and others, which is I said, we just created a really important and useful bill, but it's really targeted at what used to happen in the 1990s. So we have a bill, and we've long struggled to get this, but we are now behind the curve because back in the 60s and 70s, the focus was on creative arts, and so we created creative arts departments and so on. So 2 buildings down from here, we have a creative arts center at the university. It's for creative imagination, but yes, it's a creative arts center. And then by the 80s, 90s, the issue or the concept of creative industries had come into being. So you see it in the UK, you see it in other parts of the world, creative industries as a construct had come into being. But by the 1990s, people were talking already about the creative economy. So Hawkins' book, titled Creative Economy, and so on. Started talking about creative cities and all those kinds of things. And then the thing has now shifted in the last few years to what I would call creative capital, where the focus is on the relationship between creativity and innovation. So digital trade, iCloud, apps, and the way in which creativity is used as a basis for branding destinations, branding products. Right? So for example, creative content sells devices. Right? 60-70% of the traffic on the World Wide Web is creative content. If we didn't have creative content, we wouldn't have a World Wide Web because it wouldn't be enough demand to make it profitable. So,
Sorry, just because I don't in a sentence or two, what was the bill, the Barbados bill? What was the creative industry bill for? What was the intent? What is the state, or what is the stated intent?
okay, but the stated intent is it's creating a classic set of incentives, tax breaks, and so on for the creative industries. But it's what we call passive policies, passive industrial policies, which is that we create incentives and people come to it. So it's not focused on, for example, enterprise development, where you have startup funds or some venture capital framework that would provide a basis for entrepreneurship in the sector. All right. So, and for example, at the Caribbean Growth Forum, the last panel had young people talking, and there was a very interesting young man from Barbados who has created apps. He's 24 years old, and he gave the comment, which I thought was probably the most useful comment at the Caribbean Growth Forum. He said he wanted to find funding for his enterprise. And so he went to have a meeting with one of these organizations that provides funding. And he said everyone across the table from him was over 60 years old and probably didn't have a Facebook account. Yet he was speaking to them about how he is building apps and targeting a particular market. And he says, he was really not sure that he would get any funding. And so we have this real mismatch between the people who decide upon where funding goes and the people who are the new innovators. And that's very stark in the Caribbean. We have a very aged decision-making set of policymakers who are not going to be around for the future. And a whole bunch of entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, who are chomping at the bit to move forward and with no support. Okay? Because there are very few countries in the region that have any strong venture capital framework or basis for angel investors or anything of that sort. There was one in Barbados and it was stopped under the current government. And so, this is an interesting publication, so you should try and read it. It really focuses on the United States, but it shows that the different dimensions of the creative industries and how it's rising. So from video games to books to films to e-books to number of people, time that people are spending downloading content from YouTube, etc. People's consumption of creative content has been rising at an extremely rapid rate, faster than the growth of the global economy. Right? So the authors argue that the sky is rising. But at the same time the sky is rising, at the same time that people are taking more photographs than ever, Kodak goes bust. Right? At the same time that people are reading more books than ever before, watching more movies than ever before, Borders goes bust. Blockbuster goes bust. This is creative destruction at its best. Alright? Schumpeter couldn't have come up with a better set of examples. And if you read the story about Kodak was the person who invented the digital camera, and it used to work for Kodak. And they were like, no, this is not a camera. Right? And so they didn't really investigate it away. Right? What we're saying in this slide here is that for us to make good policy, we have to have good data as a standard in the industry. So I'm just going to keep fast quickly. The data that we have on trade in cultural goods is largely and trade in cultural goods. And if you look at it, the only developing countries or so-called developing countries that have a surplus in trade in cultural goods are the countries listed here. China meaning Hong Kong, India, Turkey, Singapore, and the Republic of Korea. Every other developing country has a deficit in trade in cultural goods.
Sorry, didn't Trinidad and Tobago have a surplus, at least in the copyright industries, and if so, what then would have?
Okay. That's copyright, that's not
It's not
trade in goods, cultural goods. So for small island states, I have another thing that, and the other diagram that shows here, a deficit. So we are net importers of cultural goods. And I have data for the Caribbean and so on. So for example, let me show you the Caribbean. Yes, these are various Caribbean countries in terms of creative goods imports and exports. It's only Dominican Republic that has a net surplus. Look at Jamaica, right? Jamaica has a huge deficit deficit in creative goods imports. And Jamaica is the country in the region with the largest creative industry sector. A large chunk of this is books. Right? Jamaica imports a lot of books, and it's mostly school books. And that accounts for a large chunk of it. So by and large, most Caribbean countries don't have a significant export of creative goods. They largely import this. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, it's mostly steel pans. Steel pans accounts for about 98% of the creative goods exports.
Keith, sorry, just to help us understand, by goods, books, musical instruments,
DVDs, paintings.
So if you download a movie, how does that factor?
That would fall in another category.
Okay.
That is not a good.
Okay.
Right? So it's the way in which, so for example,
So CDs, DVDs, books, musical instrument, right?
right? So for example, I argue that there are 4 income streams associated with creative economy. There's goods, which we call visible earnings: books, CDs, DVDs, paintings, music instruments, garments, jewelry. Right? Those are examples. Then you have services, which are invisible earnings. So live performance, design services, record engineering, legal services, etc. Then you have intellectual property earnings, which are also what we call invisible, like royalty income, licensing fees, collective administration, digital rights management, etc. What's happening to the creative economy is, for example, in the UK, they earn more income from intellectual property earnings than from services and than from goods. Because as more and more content becomes digitized, like through these devices, so has the income streams moved. So the fact that you're not doing well in creative goods exports, maybe not such a big problem. Maybe. It would still be nice to have a surplus. So most countries in Caribbean make their earnings from services, particularly live performance, or bands travel a lot, or like in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, or masquerade designers offer their services all over the Caribbean and elsewhere, so they earn money there. So, except the problem there is that we don't know how much that is. We have no data for it. So we actually don't know how well we're doing. Whether we're doing good this year compared to last year, the year before, or 20 years ago. And then in terms of intellectual property, that's the only other area where we have good, fairly good data. And that's only in relation to music and music copyright administration, because we have institutions in most parts of the Caribbean that collect the data on music publishing and what we call collective management organizations for music. Every other form of creative content is not properly managed that same way, so we don't know what the royalty income is. The last area is what I call the experiential economy, which is like media value, intellectual property, and destination branding. And these are really difficult to measure, but they're very significant in the Caribbean economy as well. So we're not just in goods. And this is data on copyright industry contribution in various Latin American countries. So Jamaica is the only country for which we have full data. There's a study being done in Trinidad and Tobago and the ECS countries as well. But the data we have for Jamaica is that 5% of GDP is copyright industries and 3% of employment. That is big. And I can bet you this is an underestimation. I have to put my head on a block for that. Right? So, this sector is really important for us. One of the challenges though is this. The bulk of our investment in this sector is in the creators. We have lots of creators, but we don't have enough primary investors, we don't have enough secondary investors, and then we have our own consumers, but we have really small markets. Our diasporic communities are another part of our market, and then there's a global market. And so the real problem is how do we ensure that we tap into the bigger markets? And part of that problem is that in terms of the value chain process, our weakest links at the primary investor level, and then at the secondary investor facilitator level. So, we have some Nobel Prize authors, but none of them are published in the Caribbean. And so, the real money doesn't come to the Caribbean. So I was asked to write a paper on Rihanna. And I was like, nice. You know, Rihanna is probably the highest selling Caribbean author, Caribbean music, singer, whatever. Because I did this data from back in 2007, 2008, and back then Bob Marley was, and probably still is, the highest earning artist. In fact, Bob Marley is the only artist in the top 100 selling artists in the world. The only developing country artist in the top 100 selling artists in the world. And that has to do with his catalog and so on and so forth. In 2005, Shaggy's album was the top selling album in the world. I'd have to probably add, if I updated this list, it would have to include people like Nicki Minaj, she would probably be somewhere in there, and so forth. Alright. So yeah, but none of these people have their copyright or their royalty passing through the Caribbean. By and large, so we are not really making any benefit in any significant way. Right? So we can trumpet the fact that we have this slew of Caribbean artists and personalities operating all around the world very successfully, but this is data on balance and trading creative services for Barbados. It incorporates a number of things: computer and information, royalties, cultural, audiovisual, and it's all in the negative, basically. Alright, so in terms of creative services, and this picture is the same for every Caribbean country, by and large. When you royalties, collected by Caribbean royalty societies or Caribbean copyright societies, we see some level of a surplus. And you know what? And when we have a song or artist with a big hit, they are pulled away from the members of our societies to join with a US-based or British-based or elsewhere. So let me move on quickly. Just to illustrate, Barbados has been using Rihanna to brand the destination, but so has been Vita Coco. They use Rihanna to brand their product. And so the value of the creative artists and so on is not just in what they sell, what else they can sell. And so that's more important. Bob Marley's estate is worth $2 million or more, but and the music catalog alone is worth $100 million US. So there's a lot of money in this industry. In fact, I just came from Bahamas, but the first time I went to Bahamas, I met the author of the song called Pumpkin in Nassau. Basically, he only ever wrote one song, and he's retired since then. He showed me his royalty statement, alright, at a meeting that I went to. And I was like, well, I learned the wrong thing this year. I did all this PhD and it's like, waste of time. So I'm treating my kids differently. My son last year authored a book. It's available on blue.com, right? So he's published a book at 8 years old. So I'm hoping that the royalty statement will start coming in. I think countries are using festivals to brand their destination. Reggae Sun Splash in Jamaica is the first of its type, being a festival tourism product, which I think the Jamaicans did badly at in terms of managing its future. So they've lost out significantly on that. And they've done the same thing with Calabash. So when we talk about innovation and so on, we tend to think about things, right? So one important with the innovation literature is that's heavily focused on manufacturing and agro-processed industries. It's very weak on services. So the literature on innovation and services is weak and underdeveloped. And secondly, the bulk of the literature is on large states, Brazil, India, China, South Korea, and so on, and very little on small states. Right? So the Caribbean reality is such that, yeah, there's increasing demand for what we produce through our diasporic economy, but by and large, what we have is a gap between what I think increasing demand for in the global market and our capacity to service it. And it has to do with human resources, has to do with lack of enterprise development, institution, and so on, as well as a limited trade, industrial, and intellectual property policies, and we need to harmonize. Which brings me to what the definition of innovation that I like to use, and it's one from the OECD. They say that innovation is not purely a technological phenomenon. It includes both technological and non-technological changes that bear on economic, social, and ecological development. Innovation may be organizational, institutional, design-related, or involve other significant changes, for example, lifestyle. And innovators are affected by incentive systems and regulations that have various sources and rationales. I'm sure you all have had many different definitions of innovation in the last few years. One thing I've been involved in that I think is part of the relationship between industry and academia is that I was involved in foresighting studies in Trinidad and Tobago, organized by NIGRIS, which is the National Institute for Higher Education, Research, Science and Technology. And we were asked to do foresighting for 5 sectors. It's very many sectors. And you're right, I don't know if you remember. I think one was ICT related, one was biotech.
Fashion.
No. One was agricultural products like nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals and so on. And the fifth one was creative industries, and I saw what the creative industries wanted. And what we were asked to do is, 1, look at the global scenarios. 2, look at the global sector scenarios. Then look at the country scenarios. Then look at the company opportunity scenarios. Then to come up with strategies, capabilities, and a roadmap. And then design a business plan. Right? Or facilitate those business plans. So that was really useful, because what we were doing is looking 10 years from now, what will the global economy look like, and where we can we position ourselves to participate in that. So we came up with a number of best bets. In fact, we came up with 6, but I'm going to show you 4 of them. So we said, all right, we need a Caribbean music portal. We're calling it all the music you can eat now. Then we're calling another one Carnival in a Box. Then the third one was tree fashion, focusing on using the island cotton for design. And then the fourth one, we're calling the idea factory, pan production cluster. And we came up with pre-feasibility studies for each one of them. So very useful, but slow or no uptake. We also recognize that for any of these initiatives to take place, you need to have at least 5 things happening. Financial, things like tax breaks, subsidies, grants, venture capital, need to some capabilities, skills training, expert advice, so on, market penetration, science, technology, and research. But the biggest bugbear, what we found, and based on my experience throughout the Caribbean, our biggest challenge is the one in the middle, entrepreneurial culture and leadership, which is that most of our large firms, and even our small ones, and most of our governmental agencies management culture that is very, very outdated, very top-down. It's very hierarchical, very condescending. There's no delegation of authority, no facilitation of ideas from younger people. And I could go down the list. And all of you know this because all of you go and live in these organizations. And you know that I testify in truth here. You cannot have innovation in organizations that have a management and leadership culture along the lines I've just described. It will not by and large. You can have bright people, and what happens is that they leave the organization, and then they leave our countries. We call it brain drain. We have the highest brain drain rates in the world. All right?
A related question from where I sit, which is in a BSO. To develop sectors, there are two things that I consider to be truths, but which may not be. One, you need to focus on the sector, on a sector or a few sectors in a given period of time. And two, you need to focus on winners within those sectors. I make no apologies for that. You can do other things as well, but you really need to have some degree of focus. In our societies, you're expected to be everything to everyone. And when you focus on a few people, which is what would end up happening when you focus on the winners, you're accused of bias, non-transparency, squandering, etc. Do you have any advice or comment?
Except to refer to Danny Roderick. He says here, here's a that point list of policies for economic diversification. It says, provide incentives and subsidies only for new activities. Establish clear benchmarks and criteria for success and failure of subsidized projects. Build in automatic sunset clauses for subsidies. Target economic activities, not industrial sectors. Subsidize only activities that have clear potential to provide spillovers and demonstration effects. Vest the authority for carrying out industrial policies in agencies with demonstrated competence. Make sure agencies are monitored closely by a principal who has a clear stake in the outcomes and has political authority at the highest level. Make sure implementing agencies maintain channels of communication with the private sector. Understand that even under optimal industrial policies, picking losers will sometimes occur, and endow promotion activities with the capacity to renew themselves so that the cycle of discovery can become an ongoing one. I know the real world, but you have to find a way to make it happen. Why? I did a study for UNIDO with some other researchers from around the world, and the colleagues from Austria. They've been able to do some really interesting things with their creative industries. One of the key things that they found is this, that 60% of all their creative entrepreneurs are operating in this part of the diagram, which is they're operating in short relationships, project-driven, very hierarchical. They're highly innovative, but there's a high risk of burnout. They're operating without networks and so on and so forth. And the problem with this is that increasingly the global economy, particularly in the creative economy, your capacity to be part of networks, to be involved in collaborations, to be engaged in strategic alliances, to be part of all kinds of tie-up frameworks is where the successful people are. Okay. And so, one of the key things, if you want to have a successful sector, is that you need to move more and more firms from this side of the equation to this side of the equation. This is what we call clustering, for example, but also creating linkages with foreign firms and getting tied up into global chains, so on and so forth. If you're not doing that, you will be operating under par. So on.
I agree with you. Let me say that
Thank you
one.
very much.
But I want
We
to
are not here
respond.
to agree with each other.
No, but I really want to respond to Nurad. The example that you gave of the young gentleman from the Bahamas to me,
It's from
Barbados, in Bahamas, was an example of someone, okay, he was at that forum, but at some point he was not necessarily a winner. He was somebody that was new, dynamic. He went in front of a group of persons and nobody, let's say, knew about him. He took a chance. And sometimes I think that there is that element that we fail to recognize, and how sometimes you may not be a winner in your sector, but you could be a winner because you have a great idea and you just need the support to get to that. And that's why I said I agree with you, because then it's then forming that linkage, which would then help to propel that person from that winning idea to having a winning business or whatever it is that they're doing. And I think that's very real. I don't think it's always pinpointing the winners in the sector. And I also think that for some economies and some sectors where there needs to be a development in that sector, sometimes it's not easy to identify the winners. You have to, maybe the winning situation would be to connect persons in that sector.
The other thing is this: we are all operating on multiple silos. So, for example, the people who are talking about innovation are not also talking in the same arenas in trade policy. Trade policy people are not talking about innovation. So, I just happen to straddle those words. So, when I in the trade policy people, I talk to them about innovation. When I'm over the innovation people, I try to talk about trade to create the balance. And so, in effect, what is required is that for our context,
I just, back in the same thing to the issue, I think that, I just want to start by saying, I think that is sometimes who we intuitively think are the winners are not necessarily the winners. And we must keep that in the back of our mind and use of the word intuitively as the critical word there. So if we're looking at a sector, we look at it and it could seem that X and Y are the obvious winners, but it is not necessarily so. And I think the process that we use to actually identify what, well, in value chain and as we call lead firms, or clustering we call lead firms, is critically important. And therefore, I think in terms of being able to protect yourself, if you're a state agency, from being accused of favoritism, I think rests with the level of robustness and the level of transparency that is built into the process that you use in order to determine how you move forward with a particular sector.
okay, but what I'm suggesting is maybe more rigorous than that, which is you do foresight, which is, as the diagram shows here, you say, okay, so what's going to be big in the global economy 10 years from now? And there are already signals. Some of it may not pan out. But you are taking a risk. That's what entrepreneurialism is about. That's what development is about. That's what innovation is about. So, you say, all right, based on all the trajectories, we know that, for example, cars, particularly in OECD countries, is going to decline. The number of cars is going to decline. Bikes are going to be up. Right? This, like I read something in The Guardian about 4 years ago, and they said that dating websites are doing extremely well as a result of the global economic recession. Why? Because people need to hook up to cover, rentals and so on. So, yeah, dating websites through the roof. They said hybrid cars, dating websites, and so on, and a few other things are future-oriented. So, there's a fair amount of data out there about what is growing and what's not. So, what you have to do is, first of all, identify what those are. And then secondly, look at your own set of capabilities at home. What firms, what sectors, etc. have the capacity to tap into those possibilities. And from there, if the sector is really small, then it's really a non-issue of who you're acting in or facilitating. When the sector is a little bit bigger, you may want to have business competitions, which is people, as for example, Compete Caribbean has been doing with the Caribbean Ideas Marketplace, which is you have a competition for accessing certain amounts of resources. All right? So there are ways to do it that makes it transparent, that makes it all about board, etc. But you will find you will always have criticisms about once you start selecting. And the multilateral institutions have been discouraging us from picking winners because they argue that concepts like industrial policy have become no-go zones. They've changed their tune now. They're a little bit more encouraging of the idea of these things. But once you call it something else, you can call it industrial policy. That sounds like you're back in the 1960s and 70s. So you call it foresighting, you call it innovation, you call it something else. To slide past that. But that is where I think, most countries that are now successful have been doing this for a long time. We haven't been doing it well enough, right? So I have my hot list of areas that are tremendous growth areas that will come to now. So, for example, the creative economy through digital economy.